Welcome to Redacted Conversations. I'm Clayton Morris. On this show, we invite journalists, researchers, thought leaders on to discuss topics that are ignored or suppressed by the Western media. Today, we're joined by Ava Bartlett. She is a Canadian independent journalist who spent years on the ground covering conflict zones in the Middle East, especially in Syria, Palestine, where she lived for nearly 4 years. Ava is a recipient of the 2017 International Journalism Award for International Reporting. She's been covering the war in Ukraine, and today she joins us from Ukraine. Ava, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Why did you decide to go to Ukraine?
Well, to be clear, I'm actually in the Donetsk People's Republic, one of two autonomous republics formerly in eastern Ukraine. And I came back here to Donetsk because I had come here in 2019 and I had gone to areas north of Donetsk, north of a city called Gorlivka, which were on a daily basis and still continue to be on a daily and nightly basis being shelled by Ukrainian forces. In violation, by the way, of the Minsk Accords of, I think it was 2015. Ukraine has been using prohibited heavy weapons and shelling residential areas, literally terrorizing the civilians living there, driving them out of those villages. And not only that, but they've been, the Ukrainian forces have been bombing the cities themselves, including Donetsk, where I am now. So I came back here because this is a very much underreported issue. It's to my knowledge, it's not getting any reporting in mainstream media at all. And if there is any reference to these republics, it's usually in a negative light and totally dismissing a modest estimate is 13,000 who've been killed in Ukraine's war in the Donbass in the last 8 years. So I came back here to do what I can, to shed some light on this issue.
When you say that largely, if it is reported, it's negative reporting or negative coverage, right. What do you mean by that? What have you seen where you've just shaken your head?
So, for example, if the republics are referred to, they're usually called pro-Russian separatist republics. And while that is true, people here are ethnically Russian, so hence they are pro-Russian. It does have a negative connotation in Western media and to a Western audience, where everything to do with Russia has been demonized for years and years. So instead of referring to these people as formerly Ukrainians, formerly part of Ukraine, and instead of actually for example, giving any context as to why they chose to be autonomous, none of that context is given. They're simply dismissed as pro-Russian separatist. So, and it's the same, by the way, with how Western media treated Syria. They either, again, don't report on issues, or they distort the way they report so that the Western audience is not given the information that's needed for them to fully understand what's really happening on the ground here.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned sleep deprived. I mean, we can only imagine, from afar, watching a war correspondent and what that looks like and what that entails. Just in the past 24 hours, what has been your experience in this coverage? How much sleep do you get? What are you seeing on a daily basis?
Well, no, I don't want to be dramatic. I am in Donetsk. I was in Mariupol on the 24th, 25th, I think it was. I might be wrong about those dates. And I hopefully we'll get into this, I was also west of Mariupol, where Western media was claiming there's a mass grave. Now, this was some days ago. The night before last, around, I think it was 11 p.m., I went with two other journalists to a district west, it's in Donetsk, but on the west side of Donetsk, that was being shelled. It had been shelled, I think, 2 hours prior. It was like 100 Grad missiles, according to reports I've seen, were shelling this residential area. I believe one person was killed. By the time we got there, the fires were out, but there was a small, like a mini mart that was destroyed. We went to a residential building behind which a shell had hit a school. We spoke with locals there, and they said, this is normal. This is what we've been enduring for the last 8 years. So that was 2 nights ago. 3 days ago, I think it was, I went to a market area also in the west of Donetsk that was shelled around, I think it was 11:40 in the morning, prime time for when the market would be crowded with people. 5 civilians were killed and over 20 were injured. And this was, again, shelling by Ukrainian forces. So those are the kind of things I've been seeing the last number of days.
Unbelievable. So Ukrainian forces doing the shelling. I want to get into some of the distinctions here about who in the Ukrainian forces are doing this. The Azov Battalion is something the Western media did cover prior to this invasion. In fact, the United States Congress covered it and demanded that we stop sending money to the Azov Battalion because they are neo-Nazis. Interesting,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But now the Western media seems to want to pretend that they do not exist. How big a part do you think they are playing in this conflict? And should Westerners be aware of it, since their tax dollars may be going to arm these individuals?
Thank you very much for highlighting that. They're playing a major part. I mean, if people are watching reports coming out of, for example, places like Mariupol, there's Patrick Lancaster on the ground reporting in English language. There's Murad Gazdiev reporting in English for RT. And there's a number of other reports coming out of there from primarily Russian journalists and also Donetsk journalists. They would be aware that the Azov were responsible for point-blank executions of civilians, Mariupol civilians, not just Mariupol, everywhere, but I'm speaking right now about Mariupol. Also of occupying, they've embedded with Ukrainian forces. So together, they've occupied residential buildings, again, referring to Mariupol. And so when you see all this footage that Western media is putting out of destruction. Yes, there is destruction in Mariupol, but they're not giving the context as to why. So that context is these Nazis with Ukrainian forces have been occupying these residential buildings, militarizing them, shooting on Russian and DPR forces, and then getting fire back. And that's where you see the destruction. So yeah, Westerners should be alarmed that their tax money is going to fund Nazis, not only Americans, but Canadians as well. I believe Canada has funded Ukrainian forces, and thereby the weapons and the money has also gone to Nazis. I think it's 1 billion. I might be wrong about that number, but it's a huge amount.
The West is told that we must support Ukraine and send weapons and money. In fact, Nancy Pelosi making a sudden appearance there to meet with Vladimir Zelensky. And we need to push back against war crimes by Russia. That is the narrative that's playing out in the United States. One war crime story that was plastered all over Western media is the story you mentioned a moment ago, the mass graves in Mariupol. The story is, of course, that Russian soldiers killed 9,000 to 10,000 people, buried them in unmarked graves. You went to this area. You saw it firsthand. What did you learn when you were there?
Yeah, and I'd like to add to about the story. So you're right; they've said up to 9,000 or 10,000 people buried secretly by Russian forces to cover their war crimes. I am emphasizing, of course, the ridiculous quotations, and they've been citing the former mayor of Mariupol, who I have no idea where he is. He's certainly not in Mariupol, as saying this is the worst war crime of the 21st century. And anybody who's been following America's war crimes around the world should be appalled at this claim. And he also made a reference to a World War II crime of 33,000, I think the number was, Jews killed by Nazis. So as I noted in my article that came out on RT recently, this is ludicrous, and it's huge. It's appalling at so many levels because, number one, this mayor almost certainly is whitewashing the Nazis in his former city and in Ukraine, and number two, to compare this, what they are calling a mass grave, to the extermination of 33,000 people in World War II is an abominable lie. What I saw was an existing cemetery, which Western media have noted is there. But then I saw rows of newly dug graves. Now, I don't know when they were dug. I don't know when the people that are buried there, I don't know how they were killed. But I do know at most there were 400 of these new graves. By the way, almost 100 of which were empty. And then amongst these graves were on the graves there were placards when the name was known and date of birth was put, and if the information wasn't available, then they just had numbers. But the interesting thing was, while I was there I was with the RT journalist and his two cameramen, and while I was there, the two men responsible for digging the graves arrived. And we spoke with them. Of course, I don't speak Russian. I'm very clear about that. So my colleague, Roman Kosarev, spoke with them, and I recorded. And they said they were responsible. They knew every person that was buried there, they specifically stated every person was buried in a separate grave with dignity, in the most dignified manner possible, in a coffin. And they even said Ukrainian soldiers were buried there. They're humans as well. My colleague Roman asked them, like, are you aware of Western allegations? And they said they were really offended by it. And they said that's absolutely a lie. And they again emphasized each person was buried in a coffin in a separate grave. So now, when you say mass grave, I think most people imagine a pit. Well, in fact, that's what this former mayor, the runaway mayor of Mariupol, said. He specifically said a pit of, I think, 30 meters wide and bodies thrown into the pit is what he said. And, that's not what I was told. And that's not what I saw.
Yeah, when I think of a mass grave, I think of World War II, images of World War II, where Jews are just thrown into a pit, nameless and covered up by the Nazis. That's what I think of mass graves, and that's not at all what you experienced.
No. And the other point to note is Mariupol is predominantly ethnic Russian. So just logically, like, why would the Russian army and the DPR forces go out of their way to exterminate Russians? It doesn't make sense.
I will ask you flat out, are you witnessing war crimes by Russians? This is something we've heard, again, the Mariupol story, but in general, have you seen war crimes committed by Russian soldiers?
Well, I have not, but I will also be very clear. I am in the Donetsk People's Republic. I'm not in Ukraine, so I cannot witness what is happening there. But now I would reference Scott Ritter, who was a former U.S. Army. He might have been Marine. I might be wrong about that.
Yes, anyway, he's a Marine, yeah.
Yeah, and he and other analysts have been emphasizing actually Russia's strategy in their what they call a military operation to denazify Ukraine. They've been emphasizing it's actually been I don't want to use the word moderate. What's the word I want to use? Anyway, they've been saying like it's strategic. It hasn't been what we saw America do in Iraq, just flat out demolition of everything and killing of massive amounts of civilians and demolishing of the infrastructure. It's been strategic on military targets, and it's been slow in the sense, not slow. I don't want to say that wrong, but it hasn't been like if Russia wanted to, they could have done a whole lot of destruction in Ukraine. But
well, I've heard it said, and maybe you can
strategically. And also another point is, and I'm not a military expert or an analyst, so I don't want to mislead people. But from what I've heard and what I've been reading and watching, they've been using a technique where they don't fully surround an area, but they surround it enough to prevent the flow of weapons and etc. to force the Ukrainian military and the Nazis with them out of these areas. And that's quite different than just completely destroying a city like, for example, America did in Syria when they destroyed Raqqa. Completely destroyed, killed maybe thousands of civilians. That's not what Russia is doing.
So in fairness, I'll have to ask you then flat out, are you witnessing war crimes committed by Ukrainian forces?
Yes. I am. I mean, I won't say that I was a direct witness to the moment that it happened, but again, as I mentioned, 3 days ago, I think it was, I went to this market area that was hit by Ukrainian fired grad missiles, again, killing 5 civilians in the prime of the day when, most people would be at the market. While I was there taking photos and video footage, I met a man who's like with a safety counselor or committee or something with the market. And he was saying, this has been happening every day and the Ukrainians know that they're firing at a market. There's no military target here. And I looked around and it was indeed a large market surrounded by residential buildings, no military target. And it was not the first time it has been targeted. So that is a war crime. Deliberately targeting a crowded public area is a war crime. And that's what Ukraine has been doing for 8 years. And, all these people talking about Russia's war have been ignoring the fact that Ukraine has been warring upon the Donbas republics for 8 years.
Right. Yes, that is something that's being ignored. Patrick Lancaster has also arrived on the scene in moments where shelling has occurred in broad daylight in the middle of civilian areas, no military targets,
yes.
No military equipment. There really no strategic advantage from what I can gather from some of these attacks.
No, in fact, March 14th, I believe it was, maybe 3 blocks from where I currently am. So in the center of Donetsk, Ukraine fired a Nik-GB missile and it had cluster munitions and it killed 21 people and injured nearly 40, and so again, firing in I think it was around noon. I might be wrong about the time, but anyway, the point being, firing on the city in the heart of the city during daytime, knowing it would kill many civilians. That's another war crime. That's not the first time. When I came here in 2019 and went to Gorlivka, that city north of Donetsk was heavily hit in, I believe it was 2014 or 2016, heavily hit and like many civilians killed, many children killed. And there's no military objective. It's completely it's terrorizing the population. And actually, the interesting thing, like when I talked with people, and I don't want to say that this is every single person here, but the people that I did speak with, both civilian and also in the DPR military, they said, initially, we didn't necessarily need autonomy. We didn't want what was happening in Kiev and the massacre in Odessa to come to us. They were aware of the Nazis in Ukraine and what they were capable of. But also they're ethnic Russians. They wanted to be able to speak their language, and they also didn't want what Kiev has been doing, the rewriting of history, wherein Nazis are now glorified and the Soviet army that liberated these areas from Nazis are now vilified. They didn't obviously want that because, this is their history. And that's what Ukraine has been doing. So they said, like, initially we just wanted to be away from that. And then because of that crime of not wanting to be a part of what Kiev was doing, the Kiev regime started shelling them and has been for 8 years.
You have been writing about, you've been showing Ukrainians that welcome a Russian presence once they arrive. Can you explain that side of this story to our audience?
Basically, if you're a Ukrainian citizen and you don't agree with the government, you can be imprisoned, you can be assassinated, you can be tortured. If you're a journalist, particularly, and there are a long list of journalists that have been imprisoned, tortured, and assassinated by the Ukrainian secret services or intelligence services, whatever, or by the Nazis themselves. So if you're somebody who is critical of what the Zelensky government is doing, and you speak out about it, then you risk being killed. So there's that aspect of living, under that rule all the time, and that the terror of thinking any moment you could be killed by the government or by the Nazis. But also there's a great deal of corruption. Okay, every country has corruption, but the Russian forces, contrary to how the Western media is portraying them, when they come, they're delivering humanitarian aid, and they're if there's destruction, they're helping to rehabilitate the area. So what I saw, for example, I came with a media delegation here end of March 24th, I think. And we were here for 2 days, and we went to an area that had been liberated by DPR and Russian forces a couple of weeks prior, Volnovakha. There was a lot of destruction, but Russians were handing out the humanitarian aid, and slowly but surely life was returning to that area. But when Western media reported on that, they reported on the destruction of a hospital there, but they didn't report that the Ukrainian forces had occupied the hospital, had militarized it, and had mined the intensive care unit before leaving. So there's a whole lot of context that's missing, that people wouldn't understand why normal civilians would welcome Russian forces. They welcome them because it's the start of a return to peace and stability. And it's, by the way, it's the same thing we saw in Syria. Western media wasn't reporting honestly on what they dubbed rebels, which were actually Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And they weren't reporting on, like areas like Eastern Ghouta or Eastern Aleppo that were occupied by these forces, that the people there were, again, the same thing. It's the same scenario. They were starved, they were tortured, they were imprisoned, they were executed by these terrorists, that the Western media was whitewashing and lauding as valiant rebels. And it's the same scenario now in Ukraine.
Well, if you dig into this United States State Department's website and you look at known human rights abusers, terrorist organizations, the SBU is listed by the U.S. State Department on their website. We just did a whole video on this. And so known war crimes, making people disappear. I mean, it's listed right on the United States Department's website. They will disappear individuals. They will be held against their will. We covered the story of the SBU grabbing Gonzalo Lira, who was a Chilean blogger, journalist living in that area as well, and had been rounded up by the SBU and held against his will for about 7 days. Then he was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement after he was released. Are you hearing similar stories to that?
Well, I mean, I definitely did. Years prior, I was writing about a Ukrainian journalist, Kirill Vyshinsky, who was at the time of his imprisonment, he was chief editor of RIA Novosti, Ukraine. And he was in prison. I forget the time now because this has been a few years, but it was over a year. I can't remember if it was a year and a half. But anyway, let's say over a year. He was imprisoned for his crime. He was accused of treason. He was never given a trial, by the way. He was imprisoned and tortured for his crime of having published 14 or 15 articles in 2014. And the articles were on what was happening in 2014 around the time of the coup. And the articles were of differing opinions. It wasn't just solely anti-Kiev or pro-Kiev, it was differing opinions. And none of them were written by Kirill Vyshinsky. He was an editor. He published them, and they all had like the caveat at the bottom. This is not written by. I don't know what the caveat was, but anyway, it was clear he didn't write them. He was in prison 4 years after the fact. So, like, just for all these people that are thinking, Ukraine is a democracy, it's not. This is a journalist in prison for publishing articles he did not write, and he was tortured for it. So, I mean, and I remember I met him and interviewed him, and he was pretty humble and like didn't go into details about the torture, but he did mention colleagues of his who were killed by Ukraine for similar reasons, persecution of people that either were outspoken dissidents or in his case, he simply published other people's work. So it's not uncommon. And in fact, I remember when I was writing about him, researching, there's a website called Stalker Zone. It has quite a lot of good information on Ukraine's crimes. And researching, there were activists. There were people that, for example, drove pensioners from Donbass to wherever they went to get their pensions, and they were imprisoned. Or somebody who donated money to Donbass, and he's imprisoned. It's like anybody who shows sympathies for the Donbass republics faces imprisonment, execution, or worse. I'm on a kill list, by the way. I don't know when I was put on there. I don't know what my crime was. Was it going to Crimea and interviewing people and finding out they actually liked being a part of Russia and they actually described themselves as Russian? Or was it coming here to the Donbass and interviewing civilians and shining a tiny light on the terror that they're enduring? I don't know. But what I do know is if I were to set foot in Ukraine proper, I would be killed. Almost certainly.
How did you become aware of the fact that you were on this kill list, and who is operating this kill list?
I forget the name of the person who's operating it. I wrote an article about it, but Zelensky's aware of it. And because when I wrote that article, I remember finding some quote. I think the quote was from the Russian website TASS. But anyway, Zelensky basically, if I remember correctly, defended the existence of the list, like saying we can't take this website down because that would be, ironically, interfering with freedom of speech. This from the government that imprisons and kills journalists. But yeah, I was told that I was on the list by a friend, and then I found they don't have a whole lot of information about me. But the thing about this list is, if they do get your passport, if they do get your address, your telephone number, they'll publish it. And then they'll let the thugs, the Nazis, do the dirty work, or maybe the intelligence. I don't know who's always responsible for the assassinations, but there was a Ukrainian journalist. His name's Oles, I forget his last name, Buzain or something like that. All his information was put on the list, and at some point afterwards, he was killed.
Unbelievable. Or not unbelievable if you've been following the story. The West seems to want to shut down anything that shows Russia or Russian presence in any other, as anything other than a negative light. That's what they want to shut down. So talking about this would make you and me Russian sympathizers or Putin supporters. So how do you handle that criticism when someone just publishes a comment on a YouTube video and just says, you're obviously a puppet of Putin? How do you handle that kind of criticism?
It's really tiring and annoying, but it's something I've gotten for years because I was going to Syria and I was reporting, not even that much about the president. If I said anything about the president of Syria, I would say he has overwhelming support by the Syrian people. When I say overwhelming, I mean like 70%, 80%. I can't give an actual number, but everyone I meet when I go to Syria loves the man. So that's kind of the most I would say about him. Most of my reporting was on the people. I would go and interview people, whether in Aleppo or Ghouta or wherever. And for the crime of giving them a voice, I was called all the names you mentioned and a whole lot more. And you know, it doesn't change what I'm saying. And I always maintain, like, okay, I write opinion articles for RT, roughly one a month. So that's not a lot of money. So, you know, people will say, well, you're just on the Kremlin payroll. Okay, I do receive money from RT, which is a Russian source, but it's not enough to pay the rent. You know, it's certainly not enough to live a lavish life. The point is, like, they're trying to. It's like calling someone a conspiracy theorist. They're trying to shut you up. They're trying to make you afraid. Oh no, you know, I'm being called this. I better not say what I'm saying. I don't care. Call me what you want, because for me, the important thing is telling the truth as much as I can. I might be imperfect. I might say things wrong sometimes, but I'm telling the truth when I say these things from here or from Syria, wherever I'm reporting. So yeah, back to the whole, like, the names that you will be called and I've been called over and over again. You know, they don't really attack what you have to say. They don't attack the content. They just call you a name. And that does work for some people. Just like if you're critical of Israel, someone will call you anti-Semitic, and you're like, no, actually, I'm critical of these policies. I'm critical of the wars. I'm critical of Israel's targeting of Palestinians. That doesn't make you anti-Semitic. But by calling someone that, you know, they're afraid their reputation will be tarnished or something. So that's the whole point of these names.
Yeah, and it shuts down conversation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole goal. They'll post these things, but they never actually watch the content of the video. They never read the article. They read a headline and they just assume. They make assumptions about it. I wanted to talk about some numbers now, Ava, if we can. There are a lot of numbers being thrown around by Western media as to the number of war dead on both sides. So the British Defense Secretary George Wallace said on Monday that about 15,000 Russian troops have been killed since Russia invaded Ukraine in February. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky told CNN last week that about 2,500 to 3,000 soldiers have been killed. Then Forbes magazine in the United States is taking Zelensky's word for it, not questioning any numbers that come out of the Zelensky government. I want to actually quote what Forbes says so we can have some context here, not taking them out of context. This is Forbes' own words. Forbes says, quote, Russia's death toll likely outpaces that of Ukrainian military personnel. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky told CNN last week about 2,500 to 3,000 soldiers have been killed, likely a more reliable figure than the 14,000 Ukrainian troops Russia says it had killed March 25th. So basically, Forbes is just saying we're taking Zelensky's word for it. What have you seen to confirm or deny these numbers?
I'm sorry, but I actually can't really speak to that. I'm not aware of the numbers. It's not something that's been on my radar to follow. I've always been more interested in the situation for the normal people, the civilians. So I'm not aware, but what I could say offhand without being able to cite any sources is that I'm 99% sure that's a huge exaggeration on the part of Ukraine and Zelensky. And I'm not surprised because that the Western media, Forbes and whomever else are taking Zelensky for his word, because that's what they did, again, with reference to Syria. They took unnamed activists who usually had affiliations to Al-Qaeda or ISIS at their word. But again, I think it's probably a huge exaggeration. And the intent is to depict Russia as weak and losing this military objective, and it's not actually. Another thing I've seen is like saying, "Oh well, Russia retreated from Kiev or from wherever," but it's my understanding is its goal was never to take Kiev in the first place. So retreating is a way of depicting Russia as weak, but it's not. And who I would recommend people follow. There's a Russian citizen living in the States named Andrei Martyanov, and he's a military expert, and he's somebody you could look to for a pretty accurate assessment of how things are going in terms of the military aspect.
Great. We'll invite him on the show. You covered the story about the white helmets in Syria. We covered that story here a few weeks ago, and we also covered reports that a false flag attack may unfold in Ukraine with white helmets arriving to assist in the staging of a fake attack.
Yeah.
Have you seen evidence of this? What is your experience covering the white helmets? And, you know, because I think a lot in the West would say, oh, that's a total conspiracy theory. And yet the stories persist. And there are stories this week that the white helmets have already arrived in Ukraine. Can you talk to that? What is your understanding of that situation?
I mean, I've seen similar stories as you're mentioning, and warnings actually from the Russian government that there will be a kind of a false flag or some sort of hoax that will be blamed on Russia, like the Bucha hoax. You know, I mentioned that, but now I can't really talk in depth about Bucha. All I know is that it was described as a massacre perpetrated by Russian forces, but there's a whole lot of misinformation about that, and it is almost certainly, if not certainly, something that was perpetrated by the Ukrainian government to blame Russia. But in terms of the white helmets, they've been used as a propaganda front, a campaign to both demonize Syria and Russia in Syria, and also to laud, you know, the terrorists that they continue to dub as rebels. And the white helmets have been heavily funded by Western governments. And they've been, basically their story is that they're a bunch of volunteers that used to be bakers and who knows what, and they came together to rescue Syrian civilians from evil Russia and Syria. But in reality, as I mentioned a second ago, they've been heavily funded by the West, and they worked exclusively in areas controlled by terrorist factions. And okay, you could still argue, well, that's because if they work in Syrian government areas, they're going to be persecuted. But that's not the case, actually. The reason they work exclusively with terrorist factions is that they work hand in hand with terrorist factions. And when I would go to areas like, for example, Eastern Ghouta, to Duma, in 2018, I think it was April 2018, all of Western media was screaming, you know, based on evidence produced by the White Helmets, which was video footage and photos, they were screaming that Syria had used a chemical weapon in Duma. And the White Helmets released a video showing a medical point, a hospital in Duma, and showing civilians like being hosed down, showing this boy Hassan Diab being hosed down, and claiming this was a chemical attack. I went to Duma 2 or 3 weeks after that and went to the same hospital and talked with medical staff, and they're like, no, here's what happened. Civilians came in and we were treating them. Somebody came in while we were treating civilians. Somebody came into the room screaming "Kamawi" in Arabic, chemical attack. So, and he was like, they were strangers, they weren't from the region, and but we were treating them, just the civilians in the hospital, for normal shelling, dust inhalation and other things. And he said they didn't show any signs of having been exposed to any sort of chemical agent. I asked them, like, were you wearing any sort of protective uniforms or anything? Because, you know, assuming they were treating actual chemical patients, then they themselves should be protected. And they said no. And I said, did any of the staff suffer any sort of problems? No. So this was just one of many fabrications by the White Helmets and the propaganda firms behind them. And the whole point was to vilify Russia and Syria, say that they've used chemical weapons against the people, and then, you know, eventually to support the Western plan to topple the Syrian government. Sorry, I'm again rambling.
No, the context is incredibly important, because everyone saw the images of these children that looked like they were covered in something. And of course, we know now from your reporting and others that it was dust, that it was not a chemical attack.
I mentioned the boy Hassan Diab. So I forget his age, maybe 12, maybe younger. He and a number of other Syrians from Duma, including medical staff, testified, you know, like, okay, this did not happen. And the boy was given, I think, dates and some sort of sweets, and told to come into the hospital. And he was like, there's nothing wrong with me. But of course, Western media dismissed their testimonies, even though they're civilians from the very place and in the very video. They were, and medical staff as well, they were dismissed as this being Russian propaganda, as Western media does. But there was another boy in Aleppo in 2016, Amran Daknish, And his house, it was said by Western media that his house was hit by an airstrike, either by Russia or Syria. And again, the white helmets come onto the scene and have him in the ambulance. And his photo, adorable little boy, Dusty, sitting in the ambulance. This photo was splashed across, news sites and across television screens around the world. CNN's anchor was sobbing for this boy. This shouldn't have happened. But in reality, he wasn't, number one, wasn't badly injured. He was mildly injured, as was the father. But it wasn't from an airstrike. It was from a terrorist had fired at the building. And the area was known to be sympathetic to the Syrian government. And terrorists basically exploited this boy. The white helmets and the media exploited this boy, claiming he was badly injured by, again, an airstrike. He wasn't. And the father spoke out and said, this media, you have blood in your hands for lying. And the thing is, this boy was said to be the face of suffering in Syria. And just a month prior, terrorists of the Noradin Zinki faction had, excuse me for saying this, but they had savagely beheaded a 12 or 13-year-old Palestinian boy. And this boy was crying for mercy, crying for a bullet to the head instead of having his head cut off. And so this had happened a month prior. And the real sickness of the story about, saying Amran Daknish was the face of suffering when this boy had been, and he's not the only one, of course, executed a month prior. The photographer who took the photo of Amran Daknish in the ambulance was good friends with the very terrorist that beheaded Abdullah Issa, not just in general. He has a grinning selfie of him with the very same terrorist that decapitated Abdullah Issa. So and then this goes back to the white helmets. So they're using these images, and they're using these purported rescue scenes to show that they're valiant and they're saving civilians, and Russia and Syria are killing civilians. But in fact, one other aspect, and my colleague and good friend Vanessa Beeley has by far done the most work on the white helmets. One other aspect is, when we would talk with civilians, they'd say, no, they didn't help us. And what they would do is they'd steal from the dead, and they're even implicated in organ theft. I would highly recommend both Vanessa Beeley and Maxim Grigoriev's work, testimonies that they've taken from civilians talking about this. And Maxim Grigoriev has taken like hundreds of testimonies, including even from former white helmets and former terrorists. And they admit, yes, they work with terrorists, and yes, they are involved in organ theft and organ trade. So, that's very Syria specific. Your question was about Ukraine. I would not be surprised if they appear in Ukraine, because they are a very effective propaganda marketing campaign to, again, demonize Russia. And that's what Ukraine needs. That's what the Western media needs in order to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine and continue, this war on the Donbass.
I mean, we've seen reports already that the white helmets are there, and I would love if you get any confirmation of that directly, please reach out to us, and we'll have you back on the show. Absolutely, talk about that. Obviously, your expertise in that is in many ways unmatched. So we would love to have more context on that in Ukraine. But again, we were bringing that story at the beginning stages to warn our audience about what sort of things people might expect to see, propaganda that might unfold as a result of that. So thank you for that context. I'll get you out of here on this question, Ava. Did you know that this would be such a controversial assignment, or does this surprise you? You've talked about being on this kill list. Do you fear for your safety?
Well, just to be clear, it's not an assignment. I came here of my own volition and on my own accord and at my own expense. And I did so.
No, thank you for clearing that up. As an independent journalist, that's important. I mean, that's important for someone to say, who's watching, to say, well, RT just sent her there. You chose to go. You chose to go there and do this reporting.
In fact, Clayton, with all of my journalism, wherever I've gone, it's been my choice and it's been my expense. The only time I've had my expenses paid for, and not even so much so, but when I went on a peace delegation to Syria in April 2014, I paid maybe my airfare was paid for. So that might be one time. The next time I went with the delegation in 2015, I can't remember the details if I paid for my airfare, but my hotel was paid for. Okay, so those are the only two times. Every other time I pay for my airfare, my hotel, my travel, everything. And I go there because, and I'm not saying poor me or anything, but I'm just being very clear. I put more money into what I do than I get from writing an article for RT or whomever, Mint Press or whomever. And I exist because people support me, and I'm very grateful for that support. But yeah, I choose to come to these places because I believe in it. And that's why, getting back to what you were saying earlier about people saying you're just a Russian propagandist. No, what I'm saying is what I believe and what I know to be true. If I'm wrong about something, I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but I chose to come here because I'm very aware of how Western media works, and I'm sure you are, having yourself been formerly a part of it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But I'm very aware of how it works, and it's not there to inform people of the news on the ground. It's there to shape an opinion. It's there to give you a story that doesn't necessarily exist. So I'm just trying to actually give a different narrative, which I believe to be truthful, because I think it's really important. All the people who've changed their profile pictures to flags of Ukraine and are hashtagging Stand with Ukraine. I think a good majority of them aren't aware of the Nazis in Ukraine. I think a good majority of them aren't aware of Ukraine's 8 years of warring on the Donbass. I think there are good people out there that say I stand with Ukraine, and they don't realize what's really going on. So
Right.
that's why I chose to come here, is to both highlight again that Ukraine continues to war on the people here. I think it's like 400,000 people, if I remember correctly. And also to show when possible, Russia has been demonized, but people here are actually glad that these areas have been liberated by both the DPR and Russian forces.
And that's why we do this show, to shine a light on these stories. And we really thank you for your journalism there. And as you mentioned, you're supported by your readers and the people that follow your journalism. How can people support you? Where can people find more of your writing if they wanted to subscribe or follow your journalism?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. So I have a blog that I started when I was in Gaza. It's called ingaza.wordpress.org, I think. Better check that up.
We'll link it up. We'll make sure we have it linked in the description below, so you can send it to me. You can send it to me afterwards, so we have the exact URL.
Yeah, thank you. And I do have a Telegram channel. I'm actually more active on Telegram than I am on my blog or I'm pretty active on Twitter as well, but definitely more on Telegram. So if people are on Telegram, they can follow me there. I have a donate button on my blog. It's via PayPal, unfortunately. But that's the primary way people can support me if they want to. And I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Because I couldn't do anything if I didn't have support. And, back to the whole vilifying thing, like, there are people that have actually messaged me and said, like, hey, I thought you were a crazy conspiracy theorist, or I thought you were a genocide denier, but I've seen this and this and this, and I realized you were actually telling the truth. So, sometimes people do change their opinion, and I appreciate that. But anyway, thanks for asking.
Well, it's hard. I will say, it is hard because we've talked on this show how Wikipedia has an obvious strong bias. And even the co-founder of Wikipedia, Larry Sanger, pointed out how it's totally biased and is just a propaganda arm. And so when you go to Wikipedia, it has false information about you. Heck, my wife's Wikipedia page once said that she was married to Lou Diamond Phillips, of La Bamba. And I can tell you she was never married to Lou Diamond Phillips. She might have liked to have been married to him at one point when she was a fan of La Bamba, but she was never married to Lou Diamond Phillips. So, does that surprise you when you read this crap on your Wikipedia page?
You know what? My Wikipedia was, I think, just a few paragraphs, and I don't remember everything. It's a conspiracy theorist, of course.
Right.
It also said that the North Korean government paid for my trip there in 2017, which is a flat out lie. It did not pay for it. The only thing it did was issue me a visa to go there. But my expenses were not paid for by the North Korean government. So that's a lie. And it has a lot of other slander. I think it's been expanded a little bit more since whenever it was created. But the notable thing is I did have supporters say, like, hey, Eva, we went and edited it to be a little bit more fair. And immediately it was switched back to the smear. And of course, this isn't exclusive to me. It's pretty well anyone who's vocal in criticizing, the Western governments that are supporting terrorism or Nazism or whatever, we get a Wikipedia smear. And it's back to what you were saying earlier about being called all these names. It's part and parcel with this. It's a means of trying to quash dissent. Like, oh my goodness, I have a Wikipedia entry that says bad things about me. I guess I better shut up now, but it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. No, keep doing what you're doing. My guest has been Eva Bartlett, a journalist covering the war in Ukraine. And I love your Twitter handle. As my wife said, I love what you say in your Twitter. I go to the areas that I write about. And that's, so many journalists, and we've seen this with the New York Times covering stories that they don't even have any journalists actually in the area, but they can still write about these stories. Thank you so much for joining us. And sharing some context and updates on this situation there in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for subscribing to the channel. Please make sure when you smash that like button, what it does is it actually pushes it out to other people who need to see and learn this information. And as Eva pointed out, there are so many people that do not understand this story. So please share this, subscribe, and get the word out. We'll see you next time.